Hello and welcome to this brief presentation on the Professional Advantage Intelligent Invoice Capture solution. Professional Advantage have been producing fully integrated SunSystems dedicated modules for many years now, working in areas such as cash management, billing and credit management and spend control with our iPOS eProcurement solution. However, we also produce process automation solutions which are either SunSystems integrated or entirely independent to SunSystems, and the Professional Advantage Intelligent Invoice Capture solution sits in this area and at the moment works against our iPOS solution for capturing and pushing invoices into iPOS, but as we go forward it will be working directly against SunSystems and also for non-Infor SunSystems users in due course. So are we all over invoice entry? I think we are. If we imagine entering an invoice into the system, in this case iPOS screen, we are dealing with a lot of data. We're needing to look at invoices and understand what fields are there, then interpret them and pass that information into the iPOS entry screen directly. And you can see here that that's a lot of fields, it's a lot of data. We're just looking at a header screen here, and that gets bigger as we add multiple lines. So the question is, why would we automate and how do we automate? And research suggests that invoices are going to be quadrupling in the next 10 years or so. We have a typical cost in the UK, according to Gartner, for entering a manual invoice of between £4 and £25, and the average cost of processing an automated invoice rather than a manual invoice is 20 times less than that. So there are many reasons why we should be moving in this direction, and why haven't we done it before? The reason for this really lies in the technology. So historically there have been many solutions out there for automating the capture of invoices, and they rely on template-based OCR, and these systems are positional, so you are using optical character recognition to scrape and understand an invoice that's been passed through, but they do need to know where particular fields are in an invoice to find them, and then for each supplier you need to understand how their templates differ. So every time you bring on a new supplier, you need to set up a new template, you need to train the system to understand that template, and additionally the OCR technology has not been that great in reality. However, we are now moving into a time where artificial intelligence is becoming more and more powerful. There are quite a few algorithms and services out there that are dedicated to scraping and understanding document data, and what we're seeing is these artificial intelligence algorithms are able to identify effectively data from an invoice without knowing where to look. So if we understand we're looking for purchase order numbers or invoice numbers or amounts, etc., these systems can look at an unseen invoice, a new invoice to them, and understand where that data may be and make suggestions and pass this through. And this is very powerful. It removes a lot of the manual work in setting up and managing those supplier templates. So while the traditional systems solve some of those manual data entry issues, they can actually create more. You know, the human entry users are moving their work towards managing the layouts and the templates, whereas if you look at the cognitive data capture, the AI solution, it's delivering accurate results without that template management, and this is really a game changer in why we would move in this direction. So if you think about sort of a scale of increasing efficiency and cost, manual entry, your accounts payable people using their knowledge to enter the invoice, putting it into the ERP system, matching it against orders and pushing it through. This has high cost, it's high time and effort. You in the middle have your traditional template-based OCR systems, which some of you may have seen in the past working against iPOS indeed, or against other solutions, and then you have your AI based extraction. That's the highest level of accuracy, it's the highest level of zero touch entry and faster onboarding, and this is where we're at in terms of the IIC solution that we're talking about today. So if we think about the traditional OCR, 50% of tasks can be automated. Maybe with the AI we're looking at 98% of tasks being automated. So these are standard statistical things coming from quite well-known studies. So I think we can all see that that's quite a big difference. If you had to deal with 50% of your invoices manually, or deal with a few percent of your invoices manually, I know where I'd go, and that's really the use of this AI technology. So the invoice dataset, what are we needing to capture in an invoice when it gets passed through to us? First of all, we have our header data, and going back to the same screen as we looked at before, we have important pieces of information such as the supplier invoice number here. We have the invoice amount, the total amount, the date. We have the currency, very important. And then there are some things that may not be on the invoice itself. So the supplier code, and that's the supplier code sitting within your ERP solution. That's not going to be on the invoice, but we could, if we were very clever, map that in there for you, and that's what IIC is aiming to do, to pick up this extra data set that may be not on an invoice at all. If we look at a line entry, we're capturing things like the description from the invoice, we're capturing the quantities, the amounts, the tax code won't obviously be on an invoice itself, but we may understand something about the tax rate. So there are other things to do other than just scraping data. We do need to be thinking about how can we best apply our logic and our knowledge of invoices and our knowledge of Infor SunSystems and iPOS as a procurement tool in order to then say, okay, this could imply something in the system. So the tax values may lead to a percentage, which may lead to an analysis value, etc. So it's the ability to contextualize and add extra metadata and deal with it effectively that really we want to bring to the table as part of the solution. So the challenges of using OCR to scrape an invoice, and we look at our dummy invoice here, is that field positions vary. We don't know where they're going to be. So we may have an order number here, we may have it down here. It may be up there or perhaps even on the line. We have inconsistent field names, so we may use description or something else, reference, or maybe PO number is customer PO number or customer reference. So these are the things that AI is good at doing and good at identifying, and we don't have to tell it that the all number sits here. We also have the ability to deal with many different styles. So any type of invoice that comes through within reason, we're able to use and understand without having to train on that particular supplier layout. We have data that may or may not be present, so perhaps there's no purchase order number here, and how do you identify the supplier? As I said, so on here, would that be coming from here potentially, and how do we make a reference to that, or perhaps using the VAT number? That would be a good idea. So if we look at our process using the PA Intelligent Invoice Capture, we're looking to receive supplier invoices sent to the company by having them pushed to a specific email address, and this is something we will provide to the customer, and you may be able to either take these invoices to yourselves internally by having your supplier send it to your AP team and then they forward it to this email address that we provide, or you could even ask your suppliers to pass it to them directly. Once that email comes through, our engine will take the attachment from that email, scrape all of the data from the invoice in the attachment using the AI algorithm to understand the data like a human, looking on the data, looking on the invoice and saying, okay, which field is which, what do I do with it, how confident am I that that's the case. And then we apply our business rules to work out supplier. And what we're actually doing is using the VAT number on an invoice to identify the supplier. So we actually read the VAT number and we make a check back through into your Infor SunSystems database to the supplier record, and we look for the VAT number. And by making a match against that VAT number, it allows us to then put the correct supplier account code into the invoice that we push into the system. We also do similar checks around PO numbers. So if we found PO numbers on the invoice, we're able to then work out potentially which supplier, and therefore look to see if there is a corresponding purchase order number in iPOS for you, giving a high level of confidence that we're going to be pushing a matchable purchase order through. If there is no purchase order number, it's going to be a direct invoice, and we can decide how we deal with that in terms of pushing it into the system as well. So once we've done this, we then produce a invoice that we drop into the iPOS environment. It gets imported using standard iPOS XML functionality, and it will then attempt to match it where it's a purchase order based invoice against an order within the system, and then pass it on where it can. Or we could put a direct invoice in, and this could then immediately hit an approval queue within iPOS, passing to a member of your team who will be responsible for coding the invoice where there is data missing. And that data is going to be the things such as your transaction analysis codes, departments, cost centers, scheme codes, etc., and your P&L accounts around items, because those things are just not on the invoice, and it's very hard to be matching what they are through contextual logic. So to do this, we're utilizing our partner algorithm company, which is SIFT. We're using our PA Stream solution, which is a very capable event-based integration and process management tool, and then pushing it on obviously through iPOS and into Infor SunSystems. We could optionally also push data in a custom stream out to other systems. So if you needed to push invoice documents into SharePoint, or if you needed to have an invoice push into another line of business system, that would be perfectly possible as a customized deployment process. So our architecture is actually cloud-based, but it has a component that sits locally within your environment. So suppliers are sending their invoices through potentially into your email environment, and then within your network you could send that email on to us into the email address we provide, which is actually in the PA cloud service. So we actually have IIC running in our cloud deployment, and our server there then passes the invoice through, picks up the invoices, performs all the scraping, applies the AI logic, etc. And all of that is our cloud-based service. And once ready, it will make any queries it needs to against your SunSystems and iPOS server back through a secure connection into a host agent, which we install locally within your environment. So that's the only component running locally, and that's responsible for running the communication with our cloud service and also making any local queries into your SunSystems server, such as for the supply codes. Once those queries have been carried out, the system will then drop the invoice into iPOS and SunSystems, and off we go inside of your environment. So we are talking about a hybrid solution with PA invoice capture, the main processes occurring in the cloud, with some local processes in your environment. Obviously talking securely with industry standard protocols, which can be discussed more with your technical people if required. Let's have a look at the basics of this process in action. Here I have an email. I've sent this to our demonstration queue, and down below here we have an attached invoice from European software specialists and a brief email coming from the accounts payable team. So in effect, what we're going to do is send this invoice through to the queue and have it processed into the IIC environment and off into iPOS. If we have a look at this invoice, it is just a basic dummy invoice that's been made for European software specialists. We can see that it has certain information on here, such as the invoice number. It has the terms, the name of the company, the demo company limited, obviously helping us to identify the business unit code that we're going to be sending through in the iPOS and SunSystems environment. And then down below we have some basic bits of information, all coming from our demonstration environment. We have a simple set of line data, could be many lines however on the invoice, and the system is very good at identifying multiple line data elements in there. And then down the bottom we have our totals, our VAT number, very important for identifying the supplier, etc. So this is the invoice that we're going to send through. So close that and we will send it now. So if we have a look at this invoice, it's now passed into the SIFT algorithm area, and the system has scanned through picking up fields. So we can see we've picked up the supplier name here, we have the date of the invoice number, various information around subtotals, VAT numbers, VAT codes. Most importantly, we have the VAT registration number, which we're going to be passing into the PA algorithm in order to identify the correct supplier in SunSystems. We have line items and data. So, all of this has now been picked up by SIFT and has been passed back into the PA stream, where we're applying logic around supply codes, various things around VAT, and how we actually form the correct invoice to be passed into the iPOS XML component. So this is not an area that you would need to access as a user. I'm just purely using this as an example to show you what's actually happened in the background there. As a result of passing the invoice out through the SIFT algorithm, the PA Streams IRC model creates an XML import file on your local iPOS import directory. So here you can see that we're looking at the iPOS standard import directory, and I've dropped this into Andrew testing to show you the file at the moment, but this is in effect the XML file that it will create. So we go and open that file. Just going to open it with my XML notepad. We'll see that it created an invoice in the standard invoice schema for the import of this data into iPOS. So you can see that it's picking up here the supplier code. That's come from our query against the local SunSystems environment using the VAT number from the invoice. We can see the invoice totals, the conversion. Here we have the attachment, which is passed through automatically from the SIFT environment, so we will see the attachment in iPOS. And then moving down, we can see here obviously the detail around the invoice line detail. Here what we've done is, because this is a direct invoice with no purchase order number, we've actually in our schema passed it to a defined purchase account code, and this will be used to route it for approval to an encoder within the iPOS environment who will be responsible for adding the analysis coding and the P&L coding, because being a non-PO invoice, it does require some coding. But that is actually utilizing standard iPOS functionality for approval routing, workflow and coding. So we can pass that very easily through a single line that's added to the iPOS approval matrix to ensure that it gets coded correctly, and then it can be passed on through the rest of the matrix as usual for approval at the financial level. So that's our iPOS file. So if we close that, what I'm actually going to do in this case is copy the file and drop it into the iPOS import directory, and obviously this would normally be the direct path for that coming from IIC. In this case I wanted to show you the file output, so I'm just going to paste it in, and you'll see that then sits there and is picked up by the iPOS service and disappears, and that's now been imported into the XML queue for iPOS. If it was an iPOS order-based invoice, then it would attempt to match that from the XML queue against an order. If it was within tolerance, it would pass through, maybe needing approval, maybe not, if it found a requisite match on order number and value. If it is a non-order number based invoice, it will be passed directly into the approval queue for coding. So if we then go and jump into iPOS, you can see that this invoice has now appeared in the invoice view. It's come in, and it's picked up the supplier invoice number, the supplier code, etc., the values, and it's been passed directly to submitted, and that is because it's a direct invoice and it's using the iPOS approval routing for that coding function, as I just mentioned. So we have a look at the invoice itself. Obviously we have detail that needs to be entered at the header level, and we have line detail. So if we look at the header level here, we've picked up the supplier code based on that reference from the VAT number on the invoice. We've got the total value, we've got the supplier invoice number, and all that sort of standard information that has been populated from XML and also defaulted from iPOS itself where required. And then if we go down, we have the line detail coming in with the values, etc., and it's passed it directly to an approval group within the system, and that is because it was coded with that particular PAD IMV01 dummy account, and this is the way that we would pass things for approval within the system. So if you imagine that this is now a standard invoice going through, really that has been purely touchless from the point of email through to the point of this invoice being sent for approval, and approval being coding within iPOS. We really are looking at a touchless process. If that had been a purchase order based invoice, if we were to look at the XML invoice queue, we have invoices here that have been coming in through XML. This is where we go to check those invoices and try and match them against orders. So if we were looking at a process whereby we bought in an invoice and we needed to then match it against a purchase order, the system would try and match based on match rules within the iPOS XML environment. So if it was matched on purchase order number, the values were correct, and a purchase order number had been passed in from the XML, which would have been scraped from the invoice, then this would potentially not be in the queue. It could be passed on for approval based on it being over tolerance, under tolerance, or just general approval requirement, but already matched to the purchase order, and all the coding would have been done based on the purchase order detail. If not, then it would have appeared in this queue, and from here we are able to then go and attempt to match the invoice. So we could actually pick a line, go and attempt to match it, choose our order detail, and once we'd found that detail, match it. So this will be the standard sort of matching process that you would undergo when you put an invoice into iPOS in a manual fashion. However, you'll be doing it from the XML queue, and that number of individual manual matches that you'll be carrying out should be significantly reduced, because obviously we're doing the automatic matching for invoices that have that order number on it. So that's really our process within the iPOS environment. Anyone using iPOS would be entirely used to this sort of environment in terms of being able to view invoices, manage invoices, work with the approvals. The key point is that we are able to bring the data into the system entirely automatically from the SIFT environment. However, obviously there could be errors, and this is part of the other benefit of the IRC environment. So where we have invoices that cannot be read for some reason, maybe there is data missing on that invoice, or it just logically doesn't make sense, we're able to email to find people within your AP team or administrator that we can set up for you with those errors, and the invoice itself would then be sent to them as part of that email. So here's an invoice, there was a problem with it, this was the problem, and then you could proceed to do manual entry for that. So we very much cover the non-happy day scenario as well as that perfect route through the system. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope that was useful in terms of showing you the standard sort of process to get an invoice into iPOS through the SIFT environment. Obviously there's actually not much to see because it is pretty much touchless. But if you do have any queries or questions that you would like to go through in relation to the process, the benefits, how it could work for you, any config options, then please do contact us and we will be more than happy to help you with a personalised demonstration, or just to email us at info_uk@professionaladvantage.co.uk. Thank you very much.